Hallo und herzlich willkommen zu unserem heutigen Panel. The Bigger the Better, die Folgen von Landinvestitionen auf Landrechte, Böden und Ernährungssouveränität. Mein Name ist Lena Bassermann und ich arbeite für das entwicklungspolitische Netzwerk INKOTA. Ich darf Sie heute begrüßen im Namen unserer
I would like to
Mitverantwortlichen.
welcome you to our panel this afternoon, co-organized with INKOTA, Forum Environmental Development, and Ms. Surrey. It's a great pleasure for me to chair this panel together with my colleague, Lena Bassermann. What we'd like to do this afternoon is to look at the impact of large-scale land acquisitions with respect to the social impact, environmental impact, and other kinds of repercussions. We have a variety of speakers or panel guests this afternoon, whom I would like to introduce to you. We will start with an Ignite contribution by Michael Fagri, who is Special Rapporteur of the United Nations for the Right to Food. Then we will hear from Dr. Sabine Dörrich-de-Sulzer, Policy Officer for Rural Development at Miseria. She will give us an update on a land-grabbing study carried out by Miseria. Then we will widen our horizon and take a look at Brazil, where Maureen Santos will join us and talk about the situation of small-scale farmers there and the impact land grabbing is having there. I would also like to extend a warm welcome to Dr. Johannes Kotschi, expert for resources management and sustainable agriculture. He will give a presentation focusing on the use of mineral fertilizers and the impact this is having on soil. Then we will be joined by Luis Muchanga from Mozambique. He's the national coordinator of the Mozambican Farmers Association, UNIC there. He will give us some examples from Mozambique and will also talk about agroecological soil processing. So that will be the outline roughly. Then, of course, you will also have the opportunity to ask questions. There will be a Q&A round. And after 1 hour of our discussion, there will be what we call a deep dive, where you can even look into some issues in more detail. But now I'd like to hand over to my colleague. Thank you very much, Lena. I would also like to extend a warm welcome to everybody, and I don't want to take much of your time, but really introduce Michael Fagri, who can't be here with us live this afternoon, but actually he sent us a video message earlier, and we asked him to provide us a brief report on the situation of farmers 10 years after the voluntary guidelines on governance of land tenure and fisheries and forestries were adopted. He's also professor at the University of Oregon School of Law. He's a lecturer there. He also gives lectures around the world on many sustainability development issues, engaging with the farmers' associations across the world. But now let's hear from Michael.
Hello, my name is Michael Fagri, and I am the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food. This means that the UN Human Rights Council has authorized me to be the leading independent expert on the right to food in the UN system. I want to start by thanking the organizers for inviting me to be part of the Global Forum for Food and Agriculture. Due to the pandemic and time zone differences, I'm unfortunately unable to participate live. The premise of this panel addresses a core question for any food system. Who has access to land and under what conditions? There is one model for food systems that is the US style of go big or go home. The idea being that farms should be as large as possible. This relies on an economic argument that measures efficiency in very narrow terms and relies on what some experts call an economy of scale. This type of policy only looks at farmland as some sort of input and food as an output, as if we were talking about a machine or a factory. Since the last food crisis of 2007, we all learned how large-scale land acquisitions violates people's right to food. This type of policy enables large-scale land acquisitions. It enables investors to push small farmers off their land. When small farmers are in effect pushed off their land, those farmers and their families often end up more food insecure than before, and local hunger increases. We also see how large-scale land acquisitions lead to skyrocketing of local land prices, which pushes many families off their land and into poverty. And then when that land is used for farming, it is usually for industrial intensive farming, which often has harmful effects on environmental and human health. The most recent Misseror report provides the most up-to-date analysis on large-scale land acquisitions in Africa, on selected economic and social indicators. What is fascinating to see is that large-scale land acquisitions in African countries is not leading to the increase of food production. This is either because the land is not being farmed, or it's being farmed but not for food, or it's being farmed but industrial agricultural methods are being employed, and this does not generate a sustainable food system. What can be done to support smallholder farmers or peasants and fulfill their human rights? What can be done so that local peasants have secure access to land so that they can provide farming families with a dignified livelihood and have flourishing farms that feed their community? First, I think it is important to think globally. Land is a very local issue. If investors buy up large amounts of land, this disrupts local food systems and disrupts the local economy. But as we all learned after 2007, what happens in one country can affect food systems around the world. Second, because land acquisition is not just a local issue, but a global one, I think it is important to look for multilateral solutions. Food systems are too complex to only tackle issues of land access or food security as a strictly national issue. Nor can we allow powerful investors to dominate food and land policy. The Committee on World Food Security, the CFS, offers a very important starting point: the Voluntary Guidelines on Responsible Governance of Tenure, more popularly known as the VGGT or Tenure Guidelines. The Tenure Guidelines were negotiated by governments through the multilateral process of the CFS. It came out of global concerns regarding large-scale land acquisition from the last food crisis. It is also important to note that the CFS Tenure Guidelines are very popular amongst both civil society and the private sector. To my mind, the Tenure Guidelines are one of the most well-regarded tools to come out of the CFS. They are based on the right to food and human rights. They are community-centered and grant local communities leverage by ensuring that no deal is done without people's free, prior, and informed consent. And so, if governments rely on the Tenure Guidelines, they would first start by developing good and long-standing relations with local communities, not by starting with investors. I believe tomorrow at 11 a.m. there's a panel entirely dedicated to the Tenure Guidelines, and I would encourage everyone to attend. With that, I thank you and wish you the best for what looks like to be an excellent lineup of speakers today. Thank you.
Mit dieser Videobotschaft hat Michael Fakhri uns schon eindrücklich gezeigt.
So I think this video message has illustrated how important this topic is and gives us a sound basis for our further discussion. I would like to move on now to Dr. Sabine Döllesch-de Policy Officer for Rural Development, working for Miseria for more than 30 years. She's been dealing with the issue of rural development. She has also lived and worked in various African countries. And this afternoon, she will present a study to us commissioned by Miseria, looking into the effects of large-scale land acquisitions in Africa, focusing on selected economic and social indicators. And with this, I'd like to hand over to Sabine and ask her to provide us with the highlights of this study. Well, before I do that, let me give you some background to the study. Large-scale acquisitions investment are propagated as an important strategy for rural development. And there's a huge focus on Africa in terms of investment. Development banks are also advocating this kind of agricultural model and see it as a prerequisite for modernizing the agricultural sector in Africa, which still tends to be very much based on small holdings. It is small holders ensuring 2/3 of the provision of basic food. They also are responsible for large parts of exports such as cacao, coffee, peanuts, and many other agricultural commodities. Large-scale investment in agriculture is expected to not only close the yield gap, but is also expected to have a positive impact on agriculture on the ground. The bigger, the better is the buzzword here. Now, Miseria asked two scientists some years ago, Dr. Regina Neudert and Dr. Lieske Vogel-Kleschner, from two German universities, to produce a study on the issue of the effects of large-scale land acquisitions in Africa. And the two scientists looked into some economic and social indicators in order to identify the effects such large-scale land acquisitions are having. They also looked at the databases. I can only focus, of course, on the key output of the study and can only refer you to the study if you want to have more information on this particular issue. There is the legend that there was a large fraction of land which was not being used and which is then acquired by foreign investors. However, this is not true. After the acquisition of land, only a fraction of the land, however, is actually cultivated. Expectations in yield are unsatisfactory. Only 44 of all contracts signed meant that the land was actually cultivated. So this is also shown here in this diagram, in fact, which also gives a comparison to other continents. Reason for this is speculation on land and water, border disputes, uncertainty about useful life, capital restrictions by investors, and many other factors. So the study came to the conclusion that there is an insufficient degree of participation by the local population who is suffering loss of their livelihood and an increase in uncertainty. Women, pastoralists, indigenous people are particularly affected here, being vulnerable groups. So large-scale acquisition also results in a higher degree of social inequality and is also likely to generate conflicts. So contrary to what is promised, large-scale farmers cultivate export products which are not destined for consumption on the ground. areas that are now used for agriculture are no longer used for food as such. This has to do with the kind of crops that is cultivated, but also the degree of mechanization. This is shown in this table here, which clearly illustrates that the crops cultivated are actually higher with regard to small scale as compared to large scale farmers. In addition, there's a high need now of seasonal workers rather than permanent jobs that are being created, and the wages of such seasonal laborers tends to be much lower than wages paid for permanent laborers, of course. Studies have made some calculations here coming to a negative employment rate ranging between -22% to -74%. So there is a high degree of redundancy, people losing their job as a result of large-scale acquisitions. Now, the main business case made for such large-scale acquisition tends to be an increase in yield. However, the study cannot confirm this. Despite higher use of inputs, there's no evidence for higher yields being generated at large-scale commercial farms. In fact, some studies even show that higher yields per unit area for small-scale farmers compared to large-scale commercial farms are that there are higher yields for small-scale farms. Now, by way of summary, one can say the following. So, what are the main socioeconomic indicators? The study mentioned shows that the narrative, the bigger, the better, does not live up to reality once it is put to the test. So the promise with respect to employment generation is not fulfilled. The yield gap is not closed. So large-scale farming is not a viable alternative to small-scale farming. Quite on the contrary, it comes with the risk of having negative social impacts, increasing the equality gap, and the local African population is likely to grow in absolute numbers, and for lack of other employment alternatives, it's important to maintain small-scale farming as a source of employment and income. So what is needed is a rural transition strategy taking into account the needs of small-scale farmers, and local strategies are vital here. In addition, what is needed is what we call co-creation in agricultural research, extension and decentralized variety development, and for other rural services adapted to the specific needs of smallholder farmers, including financial services, veterinary services, and more.
Thank you, Sabine, for your impressive study results. And now we would like to take a look at Brazil. Maureen Santos has the floor regarding the situation on site. Maureen Santos is the coordinator of the National Advisory Group of the Federation of Organizations for Social and Educational Assistance. She is also a professor for international relations at the Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro. She used to be program coordinator in the Heinrich Böll Foundation in the local office in Rio de Janeiro. Since 2008, she has been monitoring the UNFCCC negotiations for civil society organizations with a special focus on forests and agriculture. Now we look forward to your contribution. You have the floor.
Obrigada. Em nome da FASE, eu agradeço o convite, dos organizadores.
Thank you so much. Also, on behalf of my organization, I can participate in this forum today, the GFFA. And I have to say, I want to address some points, such as the land take in Brazil. And I want to also look at the conversion of these areas for different purposes, for example, livestock farming. I want to underline that there are profound changes because public policy, or rather public areas, well, they are used for different purposes and goals. As you can see here on my slide, the agricultural structure and landscape in Brazil is as follows. It has always been marked by ownership, possession, and land use. There has always been a very intensive land use and a high concentration in Brazil. This is linked to the fact that there is a flexibilization of the legal framework. We can see it here on the slide. 47% of agricultural areas are actually used by 1% of big-scale companies, large-scale companies. And we can see that soy in particular and corn or maize make up 90% of the crop harvested in 2020. 37 million hectares are being used for this production, for the production of feed stuffs. This is linked to 80% of deforestation in Brazil, which creates new areas. The slide and the map shows us where soy is being cultivated in Brazil up until 2018. And we can clearly see that these areas have grown constantly. There are 4 main states, federal states in Brazil. Mato Piba is in the northeast, and there we draw a line. So there are profound changes which have happened in Brazil, especially regarding soybeans and soybean cultivation. This is a bit of a cycle of the illegal land grabbing, land acquisition, and deforestation. There are indeed different types of land grabbing in Brazil. This is a cycle, as you can see on the slide. And this cycle shows us one thing. First of all, public land, public areas are being grabbed, are being acquired. And then these areas are subject to deforestation. And then a third step is land registration. At the same time, a lobby is being used in order to make changes to the law possible. Moving on to the next slide, this land grabbing has severe impacts on protected areas, which are to be preserved, actually. So in the context of the rights of indigenous peoples in Brazil, this is particularly relevant. What we want to note here is that this debate, well, It happens in a context of land grabbing, and it is progressing. The financial markets are strengthened, just like the private sector, private corporations. What's the impact of that? What's the consequence? Local economic activity in agriculture is then lagging behind. And there is a cycle. Deforestation, that's what it all starts with. And then we have the intensive use of agricultural chemicals, pesticides, and so on. This further accelerates this process. In the short term, it leads to higher productivity in agricultural production, and it creates a more flexible political framework, or rather this political framework, which is more flexible, allows for more use of fertilizers, pesticides, and so on. The president, Jair Bolsonaro, and since he came into office, 1,552 new pesticides and substances have been approved and entered the market. This is the current situation in Brazil. And it is also linked to another aspect. There is a more extensive agricultural activity. 4 million hectares are sold to foreign citizens. The region I mentioned earlier, Matoiba, it created a new boundary, or rather threshold, for those who want to acquire land on the international level. So in this sense, these 4 million hectares, well, this figure is to grow to 20 million, actually. We want to also show you how we are addressing this issue, this situation. It is linked to the crisis which has been going on in Brazil. For more than 15 years, this process has been ongoing. Food production in Brazil, well, it has an impact. Hunger in Brazil has been growing significantly. There are tremendous impacts on the structure in agriculture and small-scale farming.
Por exemplo, desde novembro do ano passado, mais de 1 tonelada de sementes tradicionais e mais de 6.700 mudas de plantas, inclusive.
This policy has led to the fact that traditional seeds were also distributed, and crops were also distributed. We put emphasis on one thing. There is an education, a training process, which was launched because people need to be able to understand this process. Take one example. Collective goods, public goods, are just like that turned into private property. And this conversion of the land use and the functions, well, it is done by using a lot of agricultural inputs. This has a negative impact, and of course, this accelerates the process. There is a legal framework, and more than 40 profound amendments have been undertaken. There is actually a wave, so to speak, of new legislation. And this is the status quo in Brazil. Thank you for your attention, and I'm at your disposal for questions.
Thank you very much, Maureen.
I think in the Q&A we will have more opportunities to ask questions. But now we want to turn to Dr. Johannes Kotschi regarding the impact of intensive farming and the use of mineral and nitrogen fertilizers in soils and on climate. Johannes Kotschi is an agricultural scientist and works as an expert for agricole. He works with state and non-state organizations, international ones too. He focuses on sustainable and organic agriculture. For instance, strengthening agricultural diversity in the global south.
Oh.
Right. Now, I want to share a few thoughts with you regarding the sustainable intensification of crop production. First of all, and first and foremost, the role of mineral fertilizers. We can expect growing investments in agriculture and soils, which has an impact on soils and their fertility. In agriculture, at this point in time, there is a paradigm shift. Chemical-based production methods are being replaced by organic substances, and for the spread of agricultural method, organic agriculture is at the forefront. These effects are very strong, and the agricultural industry is also contributing to it. I also want to refer to what Sabine Döllöchter-Sulzer said regarding land concentration. Mineral fertilizers play a key role in this process. Today, more than ever, we use more fertilizers. We want to increase yields and guarantee food security. Agroecology has a completely different position. Yes to fertilizers, but less fertilizers and a more differentiated approach. And that is what I want to focus on for a bit. Food security is also a question of sufficient nutrients in agriculture. It is being made more difficult to an imbalance at regional level. Some areas have an oversupply, developing countries have a lack or nutrient deficiency. But secondly, which is more important, the availability of nutrients. It's also a question of, or rather, it is also a question of nutrient availability in soils, and it depends on the fertility of soils. Acidic soils, for example, cannot use expensive mineral fertilizers, so it is not economically viable. And then a third aspect, what nutrients do our soils need? We talk about, or rather, there are differences regarding different soils, and we can try to look at the bigger picture. We need phosphorus, lime in order to offset acidification. We need potassium. We can have organic production of these fertilizers, but the reality is nothing like that. Synthetic nitrogen is dominating. It accounts for 70% of all mineral fertilizers globally. And other uses are very low. This has a negative ecological impact of dramatic proportions on climate, on our environment. So the use of fossil energies, of soils, this is very large. Nitrogen is applied to soils, humus is reduced, acidification is increasing, and soils are no longer viable. And large amounts of nitrous oxide are released into our atmosphere. This gas is 300 times more potent than carbon dioxide. But the advantage is that we can increase yields in the short term, but based on our production input. So if we use more nitrogen fertilizers today, we put food security in the future at risks, and we have alternative. Nitrogen sequestration is well known. We can produce, or rather replace it with organic substances, and it is high time we did that. We need minerals, and we need to use them to contribute to building up soil fertility and at the same time not harming the environment and our climate. This is particularly true for phosphorus, lime, and potassium too. Quite fundamentally, mineral fertilizer should always be viewed in the context of a bigger strategy for soil quality and fertility. So, we want to build up humus in soils. The technology is there. We know about them. Agroforestry, compostation, animal manure, and many other aspects and methods. We need to switch to agroecological alternatives, which are economically viable and sustainable. We need to be quick in adopting them. So I have 4 demands to our policymakers. We need to stop the production of synthetic fertilizers. We need to end subsidy programs for nitrogen, because these are a large part of agricultural budgets, and we need a tax on mineral fertilizers or mineral nitrogen. And secondly, we need to develop national strategies for building up infrastructures for soil fertility. Soil degradation must be combated using specific strategies. We need to also promote agricultural research, which supports and puts a framework on this. We need, fourthly, programs to switch from mineral fertilizers to a long-term investment in soil fertility. Of course, this has been a bit of a short overview, and I have generalized a bit too. So I would like to point you to a more comprehensive overview and detailed overview, a soil's reputation, here on the slide. So, thank you. Thank you, Johannes, for this overview. We will come back to this in a moment. Now I would like to turn to our last panelist in today's panel, Luis Muchanga. And I am delighted that he will give us an overview of the practical work in Brazil. He also works with soil fertility. It has already been mentioned. Luis Muchanga will also focus on that and focus on the situation in Mozambique. Luis Muchanga has been director of the Mozambican Farmers Association since 2011, UNAC, but he was also responsible for UNAC's lobby and advocacy work. For a long time, he studied economics in Maputo, and he considers himself to be a social activist. And I would like to now hand over to Luis.
Muito obrigado pela oportunidade de poder estar neste importantíssimo e rico painel para partilhar.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to join this panel this afternoon. What I would like to do is to give you a short presentation, which will build on what we've heard before by the previous speakers, whom I enjoyed listening. Now, what I would like to do is to speak about the experience in Mozambique, where I see a clear link to the presentation given by Sabine but also the other inputs we have heard. There are many similarities, many things in common. Of course, there's the African context, and Mozambique fits in nicely here. So there are many things in common. The idea of land grabbing for producing commodities which are not used for food supply to the local population, this is a big issue, and in fact it's an issue which has been exacerbated over recent years, because at the end of the day what it means is that the local population has fewer land available for producing food for their own purposes. So this model that we have seen recently is not sustainable, because on the one hand you have big capital, on the other hand we have the communities fighting for survival, and both want the land, need the land. That is the farmers on the one side, the local communities, and the investors on the other hand who want to grab the land. And this also, of course, must be seen against a political background, or must be put into a political context, especially in Mozambique, where it is important to ensure the right to food of our local population. So this is where really government, where public policy is needed to make sure that local communities have access to the land and the food they need. But what we have seen is an increase in inequality, in exclusion. Public policies have deteriorated. At the same time, we've seen an increase in corruption as a result of these so-called development policies applied over recent years. So it's really a struggle for seeds, water, and land. So it's a vicious circle, really, or a kind of game, if you like, which is controlled by various stakeholders. And the stakeholders engage in the struggle. They don't care about the right to food or supply of food. They only want to increase their profits. So it's very much rent-seeking based model. So this kind of development in an inverted commas model. Sorry, it was a technical glitch. So these models of development in inverted commas are not what we need in our country, because they are not beneficial to our development. Because as I said earlier, what has happened is that inequality has increased as a result also of such deregulation, and whereas at the same time what we would need was more protection of our country and more support and assistance to our farmers. So we have to fight this kind of capital or investors grabbing our land, this what has been called the U.S. agricultural model before. That's why where agroecology comes in. This is the basis for our work, because it fosters social inclusion and ensures the survival and income of all. At the same time, we use a variety of seeds. We use local seed in particular, and this is also the kind of approach we want to promote in order to step up plant and or crop production at the local level. We may not have all the resources we need, but those who do have the resources, or the money rather, they are only interested in their own profit and don't care about the well-being and development of the local population, which is very much dependent on this land being grabbed by foreign investors. So this roughly describes really the kind of development we have seen over recent years, where many negative trends have emerged. So on the one hand, there is a huge demand for land. And the land, however, should be characterized by family farm, small-scale agriculture. At the same time, however, we have seen that large-scale agricultural areas have been grabbed and are being repurposed and used for other purposes. So this has seriously destroyed our agriculture to a certain extent, and that's why protection needs to be stepped up. Otherwise, we only see the production of commodities which are no good when it comes to reducing poverty and hunger, let alone ensuring a dignified livelihood in our country. So, and these are important indicators, however, which must be fulfilled. So one can really say that Mozambique has suffered a lot from this development. In addition, we have, of course, climate change, which exacerbates these developments. We have seen many serious droughts, for instance, recently. But rural or small-scale farming can help mitigate also climate change impact. So this is another reason why we must fight this large-scale land grabbing. Thank you very much, Luis, for giving us this insight into the situation in Mozambique. We don't have too much time left, but let's have a short Q&A round now with our panelists. And let me start with Maureen and Luis. We heard a lot about the problems related to land grabbing, land rights. So what do you think decision makers should do? What should governments do? What public policies do we need in order to ensure the right to land for small scale farmers? And so let's hear from Maureen first, and then Sabina.
Obrigada pela pergunta. Pergunta difícil.
Thank you very much for this question. A very difficult question, of course, or at least it's difficult to give you a short answer to that, and only one answer, because there will be several answers, of course. Now, at the national level, the biggest problem for us is the current government in place. We will have elections soon, however, and we are all hopeful that we will see a new government, that the disastrous existing government will be replaced, which has really left a trail of environmental destruction behind, and we would be very happy to return to a situation where also environmental rights would be enforced, land to right would be enforced and strengthened to re-establish or restore the social balance, environmental balance in our country. So there's a clear need for new policies, but also for restructuring, for transformation, which would be in line with what is laid down in our constitution, where these rights have been enshrined. We do have the rights, but they have been taken away from us over recent years. So this is the national situation, but globally speaking, the situation is not that much better. There are are safety security issues around the world, a rise of extremism in many countries. However, we must not give up and stick to our hopes and do everything we can in order to restructure our countries accordingly. And this also chimes with what Luis said from Mozambique, where new models, where he talked about new models that have been created and where this shift of paradigm is necessary, and let's hope that the elections in Brazil will bring change.
Luis, möchtest du auch noch mal dazu sagen, wie das in Mosambik aussieht und ob du welche Forderungen ihr auch an die Regierung
Luis, maybe you could tell us again the situation in Mozambique and what would be your demands to policymakers.
As nossas exigências centram-se pouco no que também a Maria também.
Well, yes, our demands to government policymakers are actually very similar to what we've heard from Maureen, who spoke about the situation in Brazil. For us, it's important to step up the production of food. We have some guidelines in place. There's a framework which has resulted in a situation where the production of food has been neglected. It's no longer really a key element of official policy and strategy, which has resulted also in health problems, of course. Therefore, what our government has done is to neglect certain guidelines concerning food production. We have a big capital, we have strong investors who invade the country and to take over, and they are not interested in producing food. Quite the opposite. They really want to dismantle, if not destroy, small-scale farming and small holders. They want to grab the land from them to use it for their own purposes. So food production is no longer seen as a priority, and this is the big issue for us, and this is what our government needs to address in every respect. And as far as financing or funding for agriculture is concerned, there's also need for action. All we are asking for is that the rights that are enshrined in our constitution and which is reflected by the demands of the Mozambique population is taken seriously by our government and translated into adequate policies. Thank you very much. Now let's take a question from the chat. This refers back to the study produced by Messeria. The question is how to increase income generated by small holders without scaling up farming, without introducing large-scale farming. The focus of the study was a comparison between large-scale land acquisitions and their impact and the consequences of such of the expansion of large-scale farming. This was really the focus of the study produced by Messeria. It did not so much look into the question you raised, how to improve the situation of small-scale farming. There are many other studies, however, which look into that. There's a 2015 study, 2016 too, which was conducted in Uganda, looking at 20 years of sustainable small-scale farming in the region, where we came to the conclusion that agroecological approaches can be extremely helpful and beneficial when it comes to helping the smallest and most vulnerable groups and farmers. It helps them to step up production. It helps to enhance food security by achieving greater variety and diversification, so both in terms of income generating and food production from both perspectives. It's very helpful to the local population and small-scale farmers to take this kind of approach. So I would refer you to these two studies. And I would also like to mention that the World Agricultural Report published in 2018 also pointed out that agroecological approaches are a key strategy and policy to promote small-scale farming, and we, that is Miseria, are active in 150 countries, 30 partners around the world, and we have always found that this is a helpful approach in order to help and make a difference for small-scale farming. And you can find all these studies on our Miseria website, and you can download them there. Thank you. Thank you very much. We have no time to go into any further details on that, so let's maybe look at another question. What are your expectations with respect to the final communiqué to be adopted at the end of this year's global forum, especially with respect to the VGGTs and other issues? What are your expectations with respect to this year's communiqué of the GFFA?
kann gerne noch was dazu sagen. Ich denke mir, die letzte Bundesregierung hat ja bereits...
Well, I'm happy to answer that question. The last government and parliament too in Germany said that agroecology should play a key role in development policy, but also domestically. And now they have to walk the talk and put this into practice. This is really a crucial, major challenge for everybody around the world. The environmental degradation is rapidly advancing, and economic development takes place at the expense of our environment. So we have to restore the balance between these trade-offs, and this also means that governments must provide funding for such agroecological projects. They should really be mainstreamed into policies, and this also needs to be reflected by the research, by agricultural research in this area, where we need supportive measures to facilitate or enable farmers to bring their voice into however, it's important to take a tailor-made approach and not a one-size-fits-all approach. Thank you, Sabine. I think this is a vital demand you have formulated here. And now I'm afraid we don't have time to hear from our other panel guests, because we're really running out of time. However, this session will be followed by the deep dive, which you are also invited to join. In fact, Johannes Kotti and Luis Muchanga will stay with us for the deep dive. They will be happy to answer any questions, and there will be a second round chaired by Sabine and Maureen Santos, but now I think we have to close this session, I'm afraid. So time for me to say thank you very much for all your contributions this afternoon, and also thank you for formulating specific demands and expectations, looking at the communique to be adopted by the Ministry of Agriculture on Friday. So we heard a plea for multilateral solutions voiced by Michael Fakhri. Then Sabine said that large-scale farming is not the solution to food production, quite on the contrary. And we also heard that it's important that grabbing of public land should be prevented, if not prohibited, in the future. So a common thread in all statements was the need to strengthen small-scale farming, also the need to respect rights, to implement certain human rights, the land to right. And finally, Mr. Kochi talked about how to enhance soil fertility by the use of certain types of fertilizers, and this also brings us to the issue of R&D funding, and subsidies, also with respect to facilitating the transition to another kind of agriculture. Then we also heard from Luis Muchanga, who talked about the need for policy action in Mozambique, where there is really the imperative of food sovereignty and the need for food production, which is food that is made available to the local population. So, but now we really have to close. Stay for the deep dive, if you like, and then, of course, we all look forward to what will happen, to the decisions or the communique, rather, to be adopted by the Ministers of Agriculture on Friday. Thank you very much. Not much I can add to this. I would also like to thank you, all the panelists, and all those who listened to this interesting panel. Thank you.